My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to TheAstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be talking about a part of the Star Citizen universe which touches on most of the residents of the UEE, education and equivalency. But before we get into that, I want to thank y'all for your continued support. We are now very close to 20,000 subscribers, and that's all because of you right now. If you've been enjoying these videos, be sure to hit the like button as it really helps out. And if you haven't already subscribed, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to stay up to date on the latest videos. If you want to go that extra mile, we also have YouTube memberships and Ko-fi for financial donations. Lastly, if you want early ad-free access to these videos, consider joining the Patreon as well. All those links are in the description. Now let's talk about the most important part of the early life of everyone living in the UEE, equivalency. To start, I'd like to explain that my day job is, and has been for over a decade, teaching high school social studies in the US. I enjoy the job, and as you might be able to tell, I take some aspects with me into hobbies like this channel. So it was very interesting when the latest lore dump from Star Citizen included a long article on what my job looks like in their universe. So this is going to be a normal lore video, but with some added detail as to how it compares to the US high school system, and generally modern secondary education. Let's start with what the equivalency is. This is a certificate awarded to those who complete their secondary education in the UEE. It can be passed by completing an upper or full secondary UEE certified education program, or through passing a group of subject tests issued by the UEE government. It is required that all civilians in the UEE obtain it if they want to enroll in post-secondary education, be it certifications or universities, and is also required if you want to apply for full citizenship rights. As a reminder, citizenship is a unique class in the UEE, which is only given to individuals who have done some service to the Empire. The easiest way to earn citizenship is through the military, and the UEE military requires you pass your secondary school to enlist. Thus, there isn't much you can do in the UEE beyond your teenage years unless you have completed your equivalency. For those not familiar with the term secondary education, it's a period of compulsory education that generally starts around 13 to 14 years of age and ends around 17 to 18 years of age. This is also the case with the equivalency in the UEE. Now, the history of education in the Star Citizen universe is rather extensive and mirrors how education has developed over the last 200 years in the real world. To start, during the human expansion era in 2380 to 2530, secondary education was required by law for all born in the UNE. At this time, most humans still lived on Earth or in the Sol system. While humanity was rapidly expanding and colonizing, the vast majority of the UNE residents lived in areas where education and schooling had been the hallmarks of youth for hundreds of years. This changed as humanity began to empty out of Earth, then Sol, and began to settle the gems of the human expansion era. Places like Croshaw, Redder, Virgil, and Pharaon. While these places were rapidly developing, this didn't mean that every child had easy access to formal schools. This made it harder for families to move to the frontier, as many couldn't afford to send their children to more settled areas for formal schooling, and didn't want to put them in a disadvantage just to gain new land. In order to encourage more settlement of the far-flung systems, the UNE developed a standardized set of computer-based learning modules called the Educational Equivalency Curriculum, or EEC. These modules replaced in-person education on worlds where teachers and schools were not yet available. Though if you had access to in-person schooling, you were expected to go through the standard system. Upon successful completion of the EEC, a student was given their Educational Equivalency Degree, or EED, and often simply called their equivalency, which was as good as a secondary school certification in the UNE. This is very similar to the Schools of the Air, an education system that is still studied today. It was a movement that started in the 1920s and was dedicated to getting rural students in various countries education where no means of formal education was possible. Lessons were broadcast to remote schools, most famously in the Australian outback, via radio. Students would still meet occasionally a few times a year, but would keep in touch through shortwave radios, thus allowing for more socialization despite the isolation. If I had to venture a guess, the Schools of the Air system seems to be at least partially the inspiration for the Star Citizen's EEC. The EEC was meant as a temporary measure for in-person schooling, while colony worlds established stable local governments. However, it would soon become permanent. More and more humans were relying on the EEC as their secondary education requirement. So when the common laws were established in 2526, the new UPE designated the EEC as the standard secondary curriculum. This became the standard way children would get their education, with actual final tests to earn their EED being the responsibility of the local governments, meaning 99% of their education was remote. This would change once more when Ivar Mezer took over and formed the UEE in 2546, as the new government began heavily modifying the modules of the EEC. The Mezers were not interested in education, but indoctrination, to push their own brand of propaganda. Xenology and sociology modules became increasingly seeded with anti-alien and pro-human thought. The history module was especially modified, glorifying and whitewashing Ivar Mezer's rise to power, specifically the atrocity at Jatta. This was a string of violent terrorist bombings that took place in Jatta, the capital city of Sestulus and the Davian system. Almost 5,000 civilians were killed in these attacks, and despite investigations by the advocacy, no perpetrator was ever discovered. This didn't stop Ivar Mezer from using these conveniently timed attacks, which allowed him to claim that the Xi'an were secretly behind the attacks, and that the only way to stop them was by instituting his fairly unpopular prime citizen idea with him at its head. The Mezer's History EEC module removed any doubt that this was the case, and spun the ascension of Ivar to Imperator as a wildly popular one when records prove it wasn't the case. This is just one example of many in this module where anything and everything that had disrupted humanity was linked to some meddling aliens, and absolutely none of the very public military assaults on human anti-Mezer protesters or any directly linkable atrocities of the Mezers were ever even mentioned in this EEC. This would change with the fall of the Mezers and the death of Linton Mezer in 2792. The new UEE recalled all of the modules and entirely revised them. As a result, all secondary schools were suspended for 2 years, until a new version of the EEC with a detailed history on the Mezer era was released in 2794. It is now updated and revised once every 10 years. Today, each planet's Governor's Council, the supreme government of planets in the UEE, is responsible to offer free public education and hire teachers to ensure the completion of said education. The modern EEC is given through modules on computer programs or sent to students via Mobiglass and completed on Spectrum. However, there are still public in-person schools available for students who live near them. The quality of these in-person schools vary wildly from location to location. In places like megacities, schools can have upwards of 500 to 1 student-teacher ratio. Any teacher watching this likely made the same noise I did when I read that. For those unfamiliar, a student-teacher ratio is key for improved learning. Smaller class sizes are not just easier to manage for teachers, but allow teachers to focus their lessons and planning to be tailored towards individual students. Because not everyone learns the same way, this allows for improved retention and test scores overall. So I would venture to guess that the education systems in the more high population dense areas of the verse have some serious issues, with everything from test scores to behavior issues and dropout rates. In those massive UEE classes, the teacher functions more as a facilitator and uses the same EEC system as remote schools, and occasionally grades essays. This means the only true advantage of public schools in these locations are in-person socialization and having a teacher to help if the student has questions. However, the latter is probably not as frequent as anyone would like. This is not reflective of all public schools, however. It highly depends on the local planetary government and likely the funding for education. There are alternatives to both public schools and the remote EEC program, with both private and military academies. Private and military academies offer a better student-to-teacher ratio than public schools, and often include private tutors for their students, meaning education is far more personalized for them. Unfortunately, the courses offered in non-public schools are not covered by the UEE, and thus students and their families have to pay tuition out of pocket or through grants and scholarships. Overall, this is a very similar system to what we have now, with the module system almost a one-for-one of alternative and adult school approach to education. A self-paced, all-encompassing set of lessons, work, and tests which evaluate how well the learner has mastered the material for a specific subject. As is typical with Star Citizen, the writers did their homework to make this system, in its bare-bones structure at least, sound believable enough to exist, while utilizing the advanced technology of the verse to make it work. I'm not rushing to be a teacher in this universe, but I don't think the classrooms of the 30th century would be too alien in their pedagogy. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'd like to thank those who are on screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, think about becoming a member on YouTube. And if you want a bit more for your contribution, join the Patreon. Patreons get early ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running Complete History of Star Citizen lore series, which the most recent episode is available for anyone to watch. If you want to know what contributions get you, check out all of those videos in the playlist in the top right. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on the education systems of the UEE, and any other lore topics in the comments below. And as always, remember, ex historia ad astra.